have both been Senkos in our time, and we both hold the level 7 qualification that allows us to identify and design programs and teach children with dyslexia. And that is a big part of our job at the Learning Support Team, where we go into schools and support schools with their dyslexic children. So we're going to give you some training today about understanding dyslexia and supporting children with literacy difficulties at home. You'll see on the left-hand side there's just a QR code. If you wouldn't mind using your phone to answer that to open that QR code, if you just hold up the camera, usually it comes up. If you can't manage that, then please don't worry about it. And as we move on to the next slide, the QR code is also on that slide as well. Okay, you'll when you open it up, please answer the pre-training questions, and then you'll just have to leave it. You won't be able to submit it until the end when we ask you to do the post-training questions. So today, the sorts of things that we're covering are making sure that you have a good understanding of the definition and characteristics of dyslexia and how it is identified, but also a good understanding of the difficulties such as working memory and slow processing associated with dyslexia. You will hopefully know some strategies to help children with dyslexia and literacy difficulties at home, and you will know where to go to for further help should you need it. And I think at this point, we'll just say that we're going to turn off our cameras now. I hope you don't mind, but Wi-Fi is always at a premium, and we don't want this to be disturbed in any way if our Wi-Fi doesn't manage it. So it's been nice. Hopefully you now can put a face to the voices, but we will be turning off our cameras now. Okay. Thank you. So hopefully, yes, you've had a chance to finish to do that questionnaire. What I am going to do, just in case anybody's had any difficulties with that, is in the chat, I am just putting a link to it. Okay, so you ought to be able to, at the end, open that up and make your response. Okay. Super. And also apologies, my friend Jo here is doing the presentation, so I will be doing my best Chris Whitty and asking her for the next slide, please. So thanks for that, Jo. What we will do today, just because we have found that this is how it works best when we do online training like this, is that we will ask that if you can type your questions as we go through into the chat. And then we will try and answer them all at the end. But I will also be keeping an eye on the chat, and if it can be answered very easily at that moment, then I will make sure that we try and do that. So please type your questions in to the chat, and I will be monitoring that throughout. Next slide, please. Thank you. Right, so we're just going to start with a sort of a true or false quiz. And now, obviously, because we're not face to face, what we'll ask you to do is just put up your hand if you think that what I'm saying is true, and then obviously don't put up your hand if what I'm saying is false. And just so that you can see, there's a little picture at the top. Your screen may look like this, but somewhere you'll see on your screen either a picture of a hand going up or a face with a hand going up, and that's how you can raise your hand. And then don't forget to put your hands down at the end. So the first fact that I want to know whether you think is true or false is dyslexia affects around 10% of the population. If you think that's true, please raise your hand. Okay, so 2 people think that's true. Wait, 4 people think that's true. I won't embarrass you, but these people are entirely right. It is about 10% of the population. And so we like to say roughly in a class of 30, you'll probably see about 3 children with dyslexia. So please lower your hand, otherwise you will be answering the next question. So the next one is, dyslexia disappears as you get older. Please raise your hand if you think that that is true. Okay, so we have one person that thinks that that is true, and the rest believe that it is false.
Now,
now
this could be a legacy hand. I think it could be a legacy. I think it could be.
Okay. Well, so this one here is in fact false. Dyslexia is a lifelong condition. What does change as you get older is that you know how to deal with the difficulties you're facing, and it may appear that you no longer struggle in the same way that you did when you were a child, but the dyslexia is still there. You have just learnt good ways of coping with it. So the next one, raise your hand if you think this is true. Dyslexia can be inherited. Okay. Yeah, 4. Okay, about the same. Yes, there is a genetic element to dyslexia. And so it's always one, as a Senko, it's one of the first questions we always ask is there anybody else with dyslexia in the immediate family? And that's usually parents, brothers and sisters. Sometimes we do ask for uncles and aunts and cousins as well. And there are also other neurodiverse conditions such as ADHD, autism, and various ones like that, which are also correlated with dyslexia. They are all come under the umbrella of neurodiversity, and they do tend to be found in clumps and families. So the next one, a Senko can formally identify dyslexia. Put your hand up if you think that's true. Okay. Right. So the key word in this one is formally. So a Senko can identify dyslexia, but it's an informal diagnosis. All right. What they can do is on the systems, they can identify an SPLD, which is what we would call dyslexia. And there is a caveat in it that says identified by the Senko. This record is the same record that follows your child through. So if your Senko is saying, we believe your child has dyslexia and we've entered it onto the system as such, you can be rest assured that that information will go through from school to school as they move around, because it then becomes part of their record. However, it's not a formal identification. When they get, later on, it is not, there's not a piece of paper saying that they are dyslexic. The only people that can identify somebody formally as having dyslexia is either an educational psychologist or somebody who holds the level 7 qualification and is registered with either PATOS or BDA, which is the British Dyslexia Association. And I'll come to the question, Louise, about the benefits of a formal identification just in a minute. So that's part of the next one. So a Senko can informally identify dyslexia, but not formally identify dyslexia. That has to be somebody from outside. So bringing on to the next true or false. True or false? A child will need a formal assessment identifying dyslexia to access support at secondary school. So put your hand up if you believe that's true. Okay, no hands up. So I hope that means that you all realise that that's false. A child does not need a formal assessment of dyslexia until they go to university. That is the only place now where you need a piece of paper saying that you have dyslexia by a recognised assessor in order to access any support. So, Louise, to answer your question about the benefits of formal identification, they cannot be used for exams access in its entirety. There is a caveat that if it's done after year 9, as well as further assessment and a lot of input from the school, it can form part of the application for the exam access, but it cannot be used in its entirety as exam access. For some students, and it's a vast minority of students, I find that the diagnosis, for want of a better word, the diagnosis of dyslexia sometimes allows them to understand that it's not because they're not trying hard enough, and it can have an effect on their self-esteem. But for all those children where it has a positive effect on their self-esteem, I would say, and I think Jo would probably agree, that we see an equal number where being told that they've got dyslexia has a negative effect on their self-esteem. So the benefits are very much individual and case by case. And hopefully in a couple of slides' time, you'll also understand why a label of dyslexia is not a guarantee of any success or any benefit. So the next one, there are more boys than girls identified with dyslexia. So hands up if you think that's true. Okay. So those people with their hands up are indeed right. There are more boys than girls identified with dyslexia. However, the jury is still out whether that means that there are more boys than girls who have dyslexia. All that means is that more boys are identified, and there are lots of people at the moment looking as to why girls are less identified. And just as an anecdotal thing, in my experience, girls are less identified because, especially as they're younger, the characteristic makeup of girls often means that they try their best to fit in, which means that they learn some of their own strategies without necessarily having to have any extra input, and that they want to please in a way and earlier than boys tend to. Of course, that is just completely anecdotal, and for every girl that you know like that, there will be a boy like that as well. So, and the last one on here, pupils with dyslexia will never learn to read. So put your hand up if you think that's true. Brilliant. I'm really pleased at the lack of hands. That is false. Pupils with dyslexia can learn to read, and some can learn to read incredibly fluently, to a stage where actually if you heard them read, you would never know, and that they could be also described as bookworms. So pupils with dyslexia can learn to read. Okay, next slide, please, Jo. So I just want to talk you through this definition of dyslexia. Now, as Richard said at the beginning, this is being recorded. So there are some of these slides where I'm not going to read out all of this to you. So you may want to later on go back and read it. But just to generally summarize, we associate dyslexia with difficulties with fluent reading and spelling. That's the general initial identifiers. There also are three other areas that may be less obvious that are also features, and that's phonological awareness, verbal memory, and verbal processing speed. Dyslexia doesn't just occur if you are clever but your work looks like it's not. Dyslexia can occur across a range of intellectual abilities, and there are very few, there are no cut-off points. It is a continuum. There may be some other difficulties around concentration, organisation, language, and things like that, but in themselves, they aren't, those themselves are not characteristics of dyslexia. But if we think back to what I was saying before about neurodiversity, those would fall under the neurodiverse umbrella. And whether if you want to know how severe or persistent the dyslexia is, then it's really how they respond to intervention, to any support they put in. If they respond well, then the chances are that their dyslexia is mild. Okay, but I think it's worth noting that this definition of dyslexia was constructed by following the Rose Review in 2009. There are currently over 70 different definitions of dyslexia across the world. So this one here is the one that's most widely used in education, and it is used by the British Dyslexia Association, PATOS, as well, and by us as a team in Somerset. This is the definition that we work towards. But that doesn't mean to say that there aren't other definitions available, and I certainly have seen reports from other educational psychologists or assessors who use a different definition. So I think it's just worthwhile understanding that we use this one in Somerset because it is the most widely used, but you will find other ones out there. So next slide, please. Now, this slide is just a visual to try and help you understand that every child with dyslexia is different. And going back to what Louise was saying about the benefits of having a formal identification, a lot of people, I think, erroneously believe that as soon as somebody knows that a child has got dyslexia, that means that the right support can be put into place. However, if we think about dyslexia as this graphic equalizer that's in front of us, what you'll understand is that you've got the 5 areas that we spoke about in the definition. And then on the side, you've also got any co-occurring difficulties. So, for example, they may also have something like ADHD, or they may also have an illness that means that they have been absent from school. So they might have different things there. There may be a family history as well. What you can see and what we find are the slides of dyslexia can be set in many different ways. So you may have a child who actually really enjoys reading and appears to be very good at reading, but struggles more with spelling. And they may find that their memory is okay, actually. They don't seem to have an issue with that, but their processing speed is weak. So every child will have the dial set at a different place, which means that if you know a child with dyslexia, you will only know how that child is presenting. Another child with dyslexia will be completely different. So again, a diagnosis of dyslexia is not always helpful, because it may mean that it tries to pigeonhole the intervention that your child receives into something that may not be suitable for them. And the best way that we can learn about your child is just to try these interventions, just to try the support and see which one works. And as we do that, we will then understand a little bit more about what your child's profile is, and what supports them. And also this illustration does show that even though they may have a difficulty in one area, it is movable. Okay, intervention can support that, and their profile may change over time. Right, next slide, please. And then this is just, I just want you to be aware of who is responsible for supporting learners with dyslexia. And it'll be at no surprise that right in the middle, the child themselves and the family obviously have the most influence over the child. Okay, and you know, not to say too lightly, but actually how the family supports and how the child supports themselves potentially has the biggest influence over supporting that child. Outside that, it's the class teacher, or in a secondary school, the tutor, or the variety of teachers they have. And then the final zone there is the SENCO. And basically this means that if you as a family, you and your child are struggling with anything, your first port of call is actually the teacher. The code of practice, as it says on the right there, the code of practice states that your teacher has to be involved at every step. And actually the teachers, we know this because we do a lot of training around the county, the teachers are very well trained around dyslexia now. So please go to your teacher first, your child's teacher first. And if they're not sure, they will go straight to the SENCO and ask for some support around that. Okay. Next slide, please. So this is just a little illustration. What is dyslexia? Now we've talked about a number of these different things already when we were talking about the diagnosis criteria. But what you will see here are some extra bits which would be typical in a dyslexic student, but perhaps not part of the diagnosis. So, for example, difficulties with telling the time and left and right confusion, and they get lost quite easily. We've spoken about a lot of those things, but maybe they also have some motor control difficulties. Maybe they have some listening difficulties. They find background noise distracting, and maybe they have problems taking notes because of the listening aspects of it. So dyslexia has a whole host of potential difficulties, but I think it's worthwhile pointing out that there are some very great strengths with dyslexia. So if we could have the next slide, please. Here are some of the strengths that we can see. And in my many years of teaching dyslexic students, I would definitely say to a greater or lesser extent, I have seen all these strengths in them. And the one that always strikes me as being the most common there is the persistent. Dyslexic students are unfortunately quite used to finding things difficult and getting things wrong and having to come back and just try it again. And so they can be much more persistent than their counterparts because they have more resilience. They have had to learn more resilience as they have gone through school. And often those are the students that when you ask them perhaps something a bit more open-ended, maybe it's a problem-solving thing that you're asking them to do that perhaps doesn't even have a right or wrong answer, the dyslexic students often shine in that because they are used to trying something and that doesn't work, so they go back and they try something different. Whereas often the students that tend to come at the top of the class who always get everything right will find that aspect very difficult. So those are the strengths. I think the other one is that creative bit. Now, we hear a lot about dyslexic students who in the media who are creatives. They're often musical, maybe they're actors. But actually, it's also worth pointing out that they are creative problem solvers. And quite often it was the dyslexic students in my class who, when I was sort of trying to work out how to arrange the tables so that everybody could see something, they were the ones that going, well, miss, if you just do it this way, you'll get it. And they were entirely right because they see things in a very different way. So, Sophie, we will come on to phonological awareness later on, so hopefully that will answer your question. So those are the dyslexic strengths, and it's really important if you know a child with dyslexia that you make sure that they're aware of those strengths that they have. And you could even link them and say, well, because you've got dyslexia, you are very strong at this. Okay. So, and then now I'm handing over to my colleague Jo for the next part.
Thank you, Heidi. Thank you very much. Right, okay. So we're going to have a look now at the difficulties. So as Heidi sort of described on a previous slide, working from the Rose definition, there are 5 difficulties, and we're going to take each of those difficulties in turn. And this is the first one that we're going to look at, which is the difficulties with reading. So what I'm going to ask you to do is, I'm just aware that this might be quite small for you, whether you're being able to access this presentation either on a laptop, an iPad, or a phone. So apologies there if this text is really small. But what I'm just going to ask you just to have a look at is to try to read this passage. And the idea that we're doing this sort of activity really is to provide you with an experience of the kind of difficulty a dyslexic reader faces when deciphering text. So I just want you to have a go. And also, while you're reading, just want you to be sort of thinking about what the skills you might be using, what's your reading sort of behaviour, and how are you feeling as you try to decipher the text. So I'm just going to give you a minute to have a look at that. Okay, hopefully that's given you a little bit of time to have a look to try to decipher that text. And you might have noticed that that you're possibly using some sort of letter sound recognition to try and sort of work out the text. You might be looking at the small words to try and interpret what they could be, rather than the longer words, which could be a little bit more problematic. So your reading behavior, so that might be really disfluent and disjointed. And also is that as you're probably trying to read, you're spending so much time to try to decode the words and try to make sense of it, that you're actually losing the comprehension. You're probably unaware of really what you're reading. It's all about, the task of trying to decode. And because it's disfluent and disjointed, and you're losing a sense of the comprehension, you're also possibly beginning to be a little frustrated. You're finding it really hard. And because you're finding it hard, you're then likely to give up. So it's really getting a sense of what it must be like for a dyslexic reader trying to decipher text. You might also notice that that the text is saying sort of, one day John and Bob went for a walk. That there are letters sitting above the line, so that becomes really problematic to try and read it. Also, some of the letters are either reversed or upside down, so it becomes even more problematic to try and decode that text. So we're hoping that that sort of activity is really getting you to have a think in terms of how difficult this a task of reading is for a dyslexic person. Okay, we're going to sort of move on to this slide. And also, just like we looked at the previous slide, this also may be the way that some of our dyslexic learners are seeing text. It might be really worry, like the picture on the top sort of left. And if it's looking like that, that's going to be really, really difficult and really challenging for them to be able to decipher text and make meaning from it. But also looking at the box on the bottom sort of right, that the words become sort of quite disjointed in terms of where they're sitting on the page, that they're jumping on top of each other. So again, that becomes really problematic for them to be able to read accurately and fluently. So it's just giving you sort of an idea of really what our dyslexic learners are seeing as they read. Okay, I'm going to move on. Right, okay, so just going to sort of have a talk about possibly what reading difficulties you might see at home. So you might also be thinking possibly of a child and young person is that the difficulties are not age appropriate. That we know that as children learn the skills of developing sort of reading fluency and accuracy, is that they make errors, and those errors are going to be age appropriate at the particular time. So within reception, they're possibly making errors between letter sound correspondence. As they move through into year 1 and year 2, they may be making substitutions, say for instance in their reading perhaps is for it, and they might be making errors like that. They might also be missing out words or adding, like I've just said, adding in words. So those are sort of common errors that we would expect to see. However, as a child develops their reading fluency and accuracy, those errors become less. But if you're noticing then that the errors are continuing, that's obviously then what you might be well seeing at home. So you might also see the reluctance to read that doesn't diminish when adjustments are made. For example, sort of timing, where you might be asking to read, who they're reading to, the method that you're using, but also the book that they might be reading as well. That they cannot recall what they have read from one day to the next. So they just haven't developed that sort of secure knowledge of words and particular letter and sound sort of correspondence. They just can't draw on that that information that's stored securely. It just isn't stored securely. They may rely on one strategy. We know that some children sound out every word, although that you may know that they may well know it by sight. They have just developed that strategy and they continue to use it. They might be using their sight word knowledge, but no other strategies, reading strategies to help them to make sense of text. So they're not using a sounding out strategy, for example. They may also be relying on their knowledge of grammar, of sentence structure, to help them to be able to work out what the word may be. But also they may be working and really relying on the context of the sentence. So again, they may be using pictures to help support them with the context, but also within that sentence that they may then be making guesses determining on what that context of the sentence is. They may read the same word differently in a short space of time or misread familiar words. So like I've said, they're making those substitutions, possibly for it and is, tend to be those frequent words. They may miss out words or lines or add words in. They may read without expression, indicating a lack of understanding. So the process of decoding a piece of text is so laborious and really challenging for them that they just have no expression in terms of their reading. And you may also see rubbing eyes, twisting the page around, some eye discomfort, even when opticians say eyesight is normal. So it's really important, that children are getting their eyes tested regularly, just to make sure that there isn't any difficulty there. You may also notice as well, certainly I did as I was teaching, that that the child is moving around quite a bit. They're trying to sort of stimulate themselves in terms of, because they're finding reading, the activity of reading, really challenging. It's not a particularly enjoyable experience for them. They're moving around, wriggling around in their seat, and of course then that sort of then has a knock-on effect in terms of being able to track the text that they're reading. Okay, moving on. So strategies then to support reading at home. So I think possibly what's really possibly important to sort of consider is, does your child need flexibility in terms of when and where they read? They may be happy learners that they don't need a particular structure. So I think it's being really mindful of that. We know that us as adults as well as children, some of us really like significant structure in our lives, in our days. Other adults and children prefer much more of a flexible sort of approach. So I think it's thinking very carefully in terms of what your child would benefit from more so. I think it's creating that sort of reading ethos. So, thinking about the environment at home, having really inviting bookshelves, reading lights, library trips, to really sort of stimulate their sort of their love in reading, shared reading, disguised reading as well. That they could be, looking at a magazine. They could be reading a recipe for something that they're cooking at home. Instructions, to make a Lego model or something, that there's reading that they're unaware that they are reading. So it's also considering that really. And I think this is really important as well, is perhaps changing the listener and try some technological listeners, such recording on a phone. So rather than asking them to read to you all the time, you could ask them, provide your phone that they can read into the phone, and then that can be played back to you. You could also suggest that they go and practice a page or two of their reading before they come and read to you. So it's really just trying to encourage them, to read in a different way. Encouraging reading for fluency and expression, but particularly using a favourite book. They're likely to want to do that. So when it's a familiar and a favourite book, they're already aware of the text. They're already aware of the story structure and what happens in the story. So then they're likely then to be more encouraged then to use more expression and intonation in their reading. And I think this again is really important. Is perhaps we're wanting to step in quite early to support our learners with reading when they're making errors, but I think it's probably really important to develop that independence and using some strategies themselves. So if they do make an error, wait until the end of the sentence and ask them if it made sense or if the word looks like the one that they said. So it's getting them to be considering those sorts of reading behaviours themselves. Does that make sense? Does that word that I just read look like the word on the page? So it's really getting them to think about that. And then thinking then if the book does become that barrier, check that they aren't too hard. And there's a bit of a general rule really that if there's more than one word in 10, that they're making errors, that the book is probably a bit too hard. And also, I think it would be really important as well, just to check with the school if there are other reading strategies and games that they can play at home, or they're using particularly in school that can be used at home as well. So there's that consistent sort of approach between school and home. And looking at, say, like flashcards, there's a 2x2 program. Toe by toe, sorry, program that I know schools use, but also can be used at home. There's word wasp and hornet again that can be used at home. Okay, right, I'm going to hand over to Heidi and to looking at the second difficulty of spelling.
Thank you very much, Jo. So here's just some examples of writing where somebody struggles with spelling. The top one always makes me laugh a little bit because the child's obviously trying to write "I have dyslexia," but obviously dyslexia is possibly one of the hardest words for a dyslexic person to spell. So just given up and gone, "I can't spell." We also notice when they're spelling is that they might, in their mind, might be using some really good words like difficult or challenging. But actually, when it comes to writing down, they just have to go for the simpler one, hard, because actually that is one that they can spell. And that, that their writing is probably not going to be something they're proud of if they're going to be crossing out, if, like in that last picture, it's all over the place, not on a line, and starting in different places. So, as we said at the beginning, reading and spelling are the perhaps most obvious difficulties with somebody with dyslexia. So if we could move on, please, Jo. So what might you see at home? And again, as Jo said, difficulties are not age appropriate. It is entirely appropriate for some of those things that we will talk about to be happening for some children. And I think, and apologies, I didn't say this at the beginning when we were talking about formal identification and the definition of dyslexia, but it's worth just saying here now that it is not recommended, and certainly we are not allowed to formally identify dyslexia before sort of the end of year 2 at the very earliest. The reason being that a lot of dyslexic difficulties are entirely age appropriate in Key Stage 1. Okay, so what difficulties might you see at home with spelling? You might notice that their written work is greatly different from their speech, and this will become more apparent as they're getting older. Maybe you've got a secondary school pupil, student at home. You might, they might be able to talk the hind legs of a back donkey, about some history topic. But then when you read the essay that they've had to write or the long answer question they've had to write, you're there going, that doesn't fit with what you've just told me. You might see that their work is messy with lots of crossing outs, and that letters and words are confused. So, for example, M and W or was and what. You might see that they spell the same word differently in the same piece of writing. Again, are they only relying on one strategy? So are they only, for every word they're writing, are they only sounding out the word? You know, ideally a fluent writer uses different strategies. You might sound some out. For some you might use mnemonics, and if you need to spell the word because, you might go big elephants can always upset small elephants. You might do some words by sight because you just know what they look like. You don't need to sound them out or use any other strategy, you just know what they look like. So you might see a child that only relies on one strategy when they're writing. They may have some bizarre spellings that are completely, that are so hard to work out that you have to ask the child, what does that say? As teachers, we are very, very used to reading work that is misspelled. And so we sort of class errors, spelling errors, into the phonetic spelling and the non-phonetic spelling. And the phonetic spelling, you can work it out. You know what they're trying to say. So the word said, for example, they might write S-E-D. And whilst it's not right, you can go or said, that's supposed to be said. I know that. And that is a normal part of development. But it's the bizarre spelling. So, for example, they're trying to write the word said, and they might do S-C-D-L-T, and you're there going, no, that's, you know, you've got the first sound right, but after that, we've lost it. They may confuse upper and lower case in their writing. They may have poor handwriting and pencil grip. And you might find that they can only concentrate on one thing at a time. So if they're concentrating on their spelling, their handwriting goes. If they're concentrating on their handwriting, they can't put in the punctuation. If they're trying to put in a subordinate clause or whatever grammar structure is they're having to learn, you might find that they don't spell the words correctly. But I think it's very important because from looking at these lists of what we're telling you, you might be looking and going, well, yes, that's my child. Is it age appropriate? Is the key question, and your teacher will know, your child's teacher will know better as to whether the difficulties are what you would expect from a child that age, or whether they may be a little bit too persistent and have lasted a bit too long. So moving on to the next one, Jo. Thank you. So here's some strategies to support spelling. The key thing, I think, is creating ways to remember words. And if we think back to that dial image of a child with dyslexia, depending on how those dials are set, different children will want different strategies to support their spelling. So it's almost like you and your child will have to do a scientific experiment where you try different strategies and you see which one works. And if you have a scientific-minded child, then they may actually love that they're going to try and learn 5 words using this strategy, and then they sort of put that on a graph, and then 5 words using this strategy, and then they put that on the graph, and then they compare and see which one works. So I'm just going to go through some strategies here, and not all of them will work for your child. So you may, they may support them to look for small words within a longer word. So, for example, together is to get her. And that might help them because actually to, get and her are 3 easy words. Put them together, they make a long word, which they may have misspelt. Exaggerate the sound as you write the word. So diamond, instead of saying diamond, you say diamond. And there's a whole generation of students that walk around at the moment going Wednesday. You know, or when they're trying to write the word Wednesday, in the back of their head, they can hear the teacher going Wednesday. So actually exaggerate the sounds and say the silent sounds just to help them. Draw pictures to remember the word. Use mnemonics, I've already said, like the big elephant can always upset small elephants. Rainbow writing. Now, if you look on that slide in the top left-hand corner, you'll see the 4 white boxes. Rainbow writing, or sometimes called the 4-square method, is a lovely method, multi-sensory method to be done at home. And it basically involves any bits of scrap paper. You just fold it into 4. And what you do as the adult is in the top left hand, in the middle, you write the word. What the child then does is, and sometimes using those biros that have the 4 colours on them works quite well, they go over the word in 4 different colours. And each time they go over it, they say the letter names. So say, for example, of said, they will go S-A-I-D as they're doing it in blue, and then they'll change to green and go S-A-I-D, etc. In the next one, They then write the word, but now separately, so they're not going over the top. So they write it 4 times, one in each of the colours, again saying the words. Then they fold over the top bit so they can't see that anymore. And in the bottom left, they try and write the word from memory. Now this time they've already said the letters of the word 8 times. So they will be supported by their auditory memory as well as their visual memory of having to write the words. And so actually they should be able to say SAID and write it. And then they always like the last one is they put their, in the last box, they put their pencil down, the pen in the starting spot, and then they shut their eyes and they write it with their eyes shut, which then really ingrains in their muscle memory. You know, what does it feel like to write this word? So it's a totally multi-sensory way, and I find very effective with children of all ages, actually. Word shapes is another one. So they draw around the word and they learn what the shape of the word looks like. Highlighting vowels when they're doing it, using plastic letters, or the picture at the top shows magnetic letters, shavings foam, licorice laces, or snake at the bottom there is done in spaghetti, or dough. So, you know, just using something a bit more practical. On the illustrations, you can see the normal school one, which is look, say, cover, write, check. There's nothing wrong with that. It will work for some students, but it may not work for yours. And then the separate one is just an example of a mnemonic. And this is exactly how I learnt to spell the word separate. I was far too old when I learnt to spell the word separate. I'd always put separate until somebody told me there's always a rat in separate. So sep a rat with an E on the end is correct. So it's coming up with those just to help your child with their spelling. The next slide also gives some examples, and some of these are more perhaps what you would see in schools, but could be used at home. So say, for example, you could have a mat that has the alphabet on there with some of the more common words. You could put up a display of some of the mnemonics that you've learnt. You could, if your child is doing a piece of writing for homework, find a word mat or even make one up yourself of words that they're going to use. But then there's also games that you can play, things like Boggle, Scrabble. There's apps that you can use, such as I think that one with the eyes is Hairy Phonics, Hairy Letters, I think it is. But you know, there's all sorts of apps that can be used, and children tend to prefer that because it's very different from what they might be doing at school. So be creative, and just remember also that home is home, and you should try and make it different from school. So actually embrace some of those things. Louise, we'll come to weak working memory in, is it the next slide? No, not the next slide, sorry, in a couple of slides' time, and we will address that. But briefly, just to say, if somebody with weak working memory is struggling to remember mnemonics, then it may be that mnemonics is not the way for them. If their memory is so weak that they cannot remember them, it is potentially not the strategy that's going to work for them. Or actually, I've often found that asking the children to come up with their own mnemonics, so not just assuming that big elephants can always upset small elephants, is the one that they're going to remember, because that's the one that lots of people remember. But maybe they can come up with their own sentence or their own mnemonic for because. The next slide is perhaps a way of helping at home, is that once you've identified some of the strategies that will be useful for your child that seem to work, is to almost put them on a little grid out here, and you can throw a couple of dice, and if it's 3, you do the one in the 3rd box, and if it comes to 9, you do the one in the 9th box, and just mix it up at home. You know, don't rely just on one strategy. You know, try as many as you can. Next slide, please. Of course, spelling is more than just spelling, it affects writing. So what can you do to support your child's writing at home? Well, you can support them with encouraging them to use technology. So actually, do they have a laptop at home? Can they do that? Speak to the school about, you know, would you mind if they did their homework on the computer? Because what we've got to remember is that our children are brought up in the modern age, and by the time that some of these primary school students get to secondary school and do their GCSEs, the likelihood is that the majority of it will be done on the laptop. And if we think about the amount of time that we as adults actually spend with a piece of paper and a pen, you may find, well, actually, that's not, it's not vital. What is vital is that they have a very good handwriting that means that they can write a note for somebody to read, they can fill in a form and all that sort of things. But actually, in getting them to use ICT, especially if they've got a barrier around their writing and spelling, potentially their handwriting as well, is just a lovely thing to be able to do. It's a very difficult thing to be able to do at school, because if you get out a laptop for one child, they don't like it because they feel different, and then everybody else wants a laptop, and it's difficult. So you would really be supporting your school if they were spending more time, getting their keyboard skills better at home. You can also teach them how to dictate, because again, for GCSEs, one of the access arrangements that they may be available to them is being able to dictate to somebody to write down. Now, if any of you have ever tried that, it's a really difficult skill. And so if we can have them practicing that at home from the earliest possible age, where they dictate to you and you write it for them, then that means that when it comes to their GCSEs and their exams, they're not fazed by it. It's something they know. And it may be, as that symbol in the middle of the page would suggest, that it's not dictating to you. Maybe you teach them how to dictate into the phone or into the iPad or even into the computer, using a headset, so that, that the writing is not a barrier. But then also the other pictures are around research, how to support writing at home. Well, support the child with their research and with their planning of what they're going to write. Teach them, support them to do mind maps, or how to take notes if they've read something. What are they going to put on the piece of paper to remind them of what they've read? And that picture on the right hand side just shows how that can be done even with just pictures and the odd word, which doesn't make sense to everybody, but will make sense to them because they've read a passage and now this is how they're going to remember that passage. So using those sorts of techniques to support at home will be very, very helpful. Next slide, please. Now, there are many reading and spelling programs suitable for use at home, and I've included this slide because I know that this is the sort of thing that you are likely to ask about. It's worth saying, again, for each dyslexic child is different, and what works for one child will not necessarily work for another child. So I'm not recommending any of these for your individual child that you've got at home. Unfortunately, you will have to do the research. You will have to try it and see if it works. I am unable to tell you whether it will or not. But with that caveat in mind, these are some of the ones that I think would be suitable for home. So Jo said earlier on about Toe by Toe, Word Wasp and Hornet, and you can see that picture on the right hand side. That red book is the Toe by Toe book, and you can just about see on that right hand side page of it, there's a list of nonsense words and syllables that the child has to read, and each time they get it correct they get a tick, and as soon as there's 3 ticks it's considered read, and they can then move on to the next page. It's very good because it can be done very quickly. It doesn't feel like reading. If you've got a child who's been turned off reading books and sentences, then this might actually work very well. But the Word Wasp and the Hornet are the sort of like the baby brother and the baby sister of Toe by Toe. Toe by Toe just does the reading. Word Wasp and Hornet also do spelling as well. Hornet is the primer. Hornet is the one that follows a sort of Key Stage 1 programme. Word Wasp is more Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3. And Toe by Toe can be used at any sort of time. So that's one thing. It is also recommended, it is evidence-based, that this can work. Precision teaching is another one. You and I may remember this from our school days as basically flashcards. How quickly can you read the flashcard? And the precision teaching probe is what is shown there, that picture. You can't read it, but basically it's a sheet that has 4 or 5 words that are just repeated and mixed up on them. we haven't gone into detail about precision teaching because it's quite there's quite a lot, but it's not difficult, and you can Google it and find more about it. But in essence, what it is flashcards. It's learning things by sight, and you concentrate just on a few of them and you do them repeatedly, rather than having a bank of 30 flashcards or 30 different words. You might have 30 flashcards made up from 4 different words that you just repeat. There are some online programs such as IDL Cloud, Nessie, IXL, Lexia, Dyslexia Gold, all been either recommended by the British Dyslexia Association or have got their own evidence basis to say that they can be effective. But warning, and I've put the warning thing, negotiate a free trial before you buy it. Okay, they want you to buy it, so they're likely to give you a free trial, and then you and your child can sit together and think, well, actually, is this going to work for us? Do we like it? So, and then finally, as we've mentioned before, there's some apps such as Squeebles, Hairy Letters, and then that circle that you can see there is what's actually called an app wheel, and it's found on the Call Scotland website. And what it does is you can go, you download that, but as you click on each one of those little pictures, it takes you to the app in the App Store. So rather than me telling you about the 100 different apps that are on there, I would suggest that that's the sort of thing that perhaps you go and have a look through. Sophie, I have seen your question and we will come back to that one at the end. Okay, thank you very much. Next slide, Jo, over to you.
Thank you, Heidi. Thank you. Right, okay, so throughout the presentation so far, we've looked at the areas of difficulty, so reading and spelling, which, and the spelling obviously is affecting writing. So this sort of visual here that we've got on the screen sort of clearly illustrates what can be seen or noticed perhaps in the classroom and at home. So all of this sort of the difficulties that are sitting above the water level is the sort of the tip of the icebergs, you know. So we've looked at possibly we might be seeing at home, might be sort of those weak writing skills, poor letter formation, incomplete work possibly, delayed spelling skills, poor letter formation, and then also, as we were saying, weak reading, and obviously poor phonic skills, which might then have an effect on low self-esteem and self-confidence. So they're sort of sitting above the and sit sort of in the tip of the iceberg. However, what we're very aware of as well in terms of those 5 difficulties from the definition, there are 3 others that we need to be very mindful of, but those can also be hidden difficulties that lie below the surface, and we're going to begin to look at those in a bit more depth now. So we're going to look at weak memory, poor phonological awareness, and we know, Sophie, you asked that question, so we're going to go into that in a little bit, and also slow processing. But with those difficulties that are sitting underneath the surface, so they could be sort of hidden, is that we need to then sort of develop some strategies, and they need to be applied to address those hidden barriers, not just deal with the things that we can see and are obvious in the classroom or at home. Okay. Right, so what we're going to do is we're going to focus this little bit now on working memory, and we've got Susan Gathercole, and she's a guru really in working memory. She's the Director of Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit, and she's going to explain working memory. If you want to watch it again after today's presentation, you can find it on YouTube. So if you just put in Susan Gatherhole, what is working memory, that should load for you. So what's important, just before I play the video, is just explain what working memory is. And working memory sort of lasts for seconds only, and it's our capacity to hold material mind and manipulate it's necessary for a brief period, and it's limited in capacity. And what we know with children and young people with working memory difficulties is that they have reduced capacity in working memory. And really, I suppose, again, trying to visualize that it's that mental sort of workspace or jotting pad for information that we need. And this capacity is really crucial from many aspects of all the tasks that we do in our daily lives. Okay, so I'm just going to play that now. Hopefully you'll be able to hear that. Take a little time to load. Okay, so I'm hopeful that that video sort of gave you a really good sort of explanation in terms of what working memory is, and how that can impact on our children and young people, but also in terms of how we can adjust the environment, and also sort of to reduce the amount of information as well that they're having to store, that can be really sort of demanding for them. So it's really asking them to remember less and simplify really what they're having to remember. And there could be many ways that can be done in terms of the class and any memory aids that could be taught for particular sort of children and young people to support them with their working memory. So just moved on then to how those difficulties can impact on our children and young people. So that can impact on mental mass, particularly, you know, thinking about times tables tests, for example, 3 times 4, they've got to remember 3 and 4 and that they are multiplying. So they've got to hold that information in their head. Then the next step will then be trying to work out that answer, work it, and then remembering that answer and then writing it down. So thinking about, how that working memory is going to really impact them on mental maths tasks. Also thinking about for their reading, for blending for reading, and obviously segmenting for spelling. So thinking about at, so having to blend or remember what was the first sound I sounded out, remembering the second and blending those together, and also the opposite to that, then segmenting a word for spelling. So for instance, lamp, then being able to remember the first letter that they've got to write, and the last letter, and remembering the letters in between. Also sort of retaining instructions. You might have children, young people that at the beginning of the day, right, brush your teeth, put your shoes on, pick up your school bag and meet me at the front door. That they would have possibly either remembered the first instruction or the last instruction, but they've lost all the information in between. So you might find they've done one of the things that you've asked them to have done, or none of them. And they just cannot retain those instructions, and having to remember difficult and demanding instructions as well. So as Susan described, it's trying to reduce the amount that they have to remember and simplifying what they have to remember. Also thinking about multitasking, having to do multiple tasks, say like writing notes when listening to the teacher. So they're having to use their auditory memory as well as thinking about the visual memory of writing particular words. Also accessing information sort of given orally, like we just described. So following what's been said in a lesson, and revising for tests and exams can be really challenging for them as well. Okay, so moving on really to ways really to improve and just really to support your child with memory difficulties at home. So using visuals such as job cards and visual timetables. Thinking back, Louise, to your comment in terms of how to get a child with weak working memory to remember all of the mnemonics. Just thinking back to Heidi's little visual really about the word separate and rat. Rather than having to rely on his auditory memory, being able to see it visually, and those, the letters that were within the word separate, either in different colours, would really support your child or young person to be able to remember that particular word. So visuals are going to be really, really key to support them with their working memory. So job cards, so for instance, thinking about the instructions, remembering to brush their teeth, put their shoes on, if they've got cards, that they may be able to use, so they're using those independently. Visual timetable, thinking about, well, when do I need my PE kit? What day is it I need my PE kit? Having that on the fridge or on the wardrobe door. Those are going to really support them to be able to remember those key parts of their week. Memory games and apps. So search for brain training games in your app store. There's lots of them there. Again, that you could probably get some sort of free trials before having to pay for any that you found are particularly useful for your child or young person at home. Find out what topics are about to be covered and use sites as IXL or BBC Bite Size to go over what they would have learned in previous years. I think that's really, really key. Encourage discussion about what's happened that day over meals, not really sort of focusing particularly on the lesson, in their day as a whole, just trying to sort of recapture the day using their memory and supporting their memory. And again, modeling strategies that you use to your children and help your child to try to remember them for themselves. So being really explicit about, you know, grief, you know, I've got to remember this particular thing, right? I use this particular strategy to help me remember this, otherwise I'm just not going to. It's really, really key that if you can be really explicit about that, that's going to really support them and realise that it's not just them that are forgetting and need support to remember things. I think that's really key. Right, I'm just going to hand over to Heidi to explain processing speed.
Thank you, Jo. Now, I tend to find in my meetings when I have meetings with parents, reading, spelling, and memory, they all sort of they understand. But processing speed and phonological awareness are words that are not in our normal everyday language. So I'm going to just be spending some time explaining those to you. So basically, what is processing speed? It is the speed at which your brain transfers information around it to get to the right place. So if you look at the picture on the left, information comes into your brain through your senses. The two they've got there is the visual and the auditory, so eyes and ears. But actually, we know that there are countless sensors that give information into your brain. But once it's come into your brain from one of the sensors, it then has to move around the brain till it gets to the right part of the brain for that particular piece of information that it's got. And, you know, different information will travel to different parts of the brain. Inside our brain, it looks a bit like the picture on the right-hand side. We have neurons that the information travels along, and they jump between each other. They have little gaps called synapses, and the information then sort of jumps as an electric charge along those. But as you can see from that picture, neurons have different widths. And I like to use the image, especially with children, of roads, in that our roads can sometimes vary in thickness. So we might actually just have a path that we have to sort of push all the brambles apart. There may be a country lane, you might have an A road, or you might have a motorway. And obviously, you can travel faster down a motorway than you can through a path in the middle of a woods. And that is, in a nutshell, why our processing speed may be different for certain tasks, because the neuron that information is travelling along is wider, and it has had better upkeep. It doesn't mean to say that if they're narrow, they have to stay narrow. We know that by walking a path many times, it will become wider. And A roads are often turned into motorways later on as more traffic goes along them. So that is, in a nutshell, what processing speed is. It's the way that the speed that information travels around our brain. And I think it's also worth saying that sometimes part of that speed issue might be because it's not taken the most direct route. Now, I live in Yeovil, and most of the students I see are in South Somerset, so I often describe it. I say, if we were going to Taunton, you'd get on the A303, turn right at the Burger King, and you'll get up to Taunton that way. But sometimes you might want to go cross country through Glastonbury. It might take you longer, but you'll still get to the same place. And that is another element of processing speed difficulty. You'll get to the same place, it just may take you longer because you're going in a different route, which again, I think links back to that creativity of dyslexic students, that they will often find alternative places where the way that they want to go is difficult. They'll go a different way. Next slide, please, Jo. So what difficulties might you see at home? And I think it's very interesting to understand that memory relies on processing. So if your processing speed is slow, it takes you longer to process things, your memory will be affected. So you might see a lot of memory difficulties or things that appear to be memory difficulties. So for example, some word finding difficulties, that they can't think of the right word and they're going, oh, we're going to do that thing there, and they use lots of gestures and non-committal words like thingy or flip or whatever they might use. They may require more thinking time. They do get there in the end, but they may require more time to think about it. They may find it might be slow for them to find the correct word or sound needed for reading. So it's not that they don't know their phonics and they can't read, it's just slower for them to get there. And that in turn, of course, will lead them to become perhaps a less fluent reader or writer. It definitely mean that they take longer to complete tasks, and they may actually tire more easily than their friends, because they may be having to go different routes and longer routes to get to the same place. And in particular, they tend to find it difficult to work under timed conditions. So those are some of the difficulties you may see at home, and they may be linked to some memory difficulties as well. We're going to show you a video now, and this one is, hopefully will put a bit of smile on your face. A bit of John Cleese always does that. And it illustrates perhaps difficulties with the speed of processing. And John Cleese is playing a teacher here, and he's giving instructions in the classroom. And I know you guys are not teachers and your home is not a classroom, but I know from being a parent that I have been guilty of giving my daughter instructions like this and then wanting to know why she hasn't managed to process all of them. So if you wouldn't mind playing, Jo, we'll just have a giggle for a moment. Thank you very much. Sam, I'm very sorry that you couldn't hear the video. I was able to hear it, so I'm wondering whether it might be an issue your end. But if you do want to have a look at that later on, if you just Google John Cleese, It's Perfectly Simple is the name of that video, and it's just a little bit of fun. There wasn't any, don't worry, you haven't missed anything vital. It's just a little bit of fun about how we sometimes overload our children with instructions and wonder why they don't actually process any of it. Jo, could we have the next slide, please? So how can you help a child with slow processing speed at home? The first thing is, don't rush them, unfortunately. Oh, back again, sorry, Jo. There we go. Don't rush them.
Apologies.
That's okay. We know that stress affects speed, and I think that's something that perhaps we all know even as an adult. The more stressed you are, the slower you end up going because you make mistakes. So it's about giving plenty of time for them to do whatever you're asking them to do. Reduce the amount of information that you are giving them. So, for example, if you're trying to talk to them, what other information is going into their brain? Are they is a TV on in the background, so that there's more auditory noise going in through their ears? Are you moving around as you're talking? So there's actually some visual distraction going on, and if you can, just use short sentences with them so that they're actually got less words that need to travel around their brain in order to be able to understand. Giving visual or oral countdown. So you may want to use a timer, you know, by the time this goes off. But actually, personally, I prefer a song. So you put a song on, and by the end of this song, I'd like you sitting with your shoes on, ready to go to school. And you know, to me, that's a little bit less threatening than a song, than a timer. But actually, timers are often used, and for some children, are perfectly usable. Um, Practicing some of those common skills to make them faster or more fluent, to free up that brain space. So again, it's back to that precision teaching of you know, going over and over skills, and at home you might find that that's skills like getting dressed, doing shoelaces, although most children have Velcro nowadays, but just that sort of some of the skills that they need every single day. Practice them, because if they can go faster on that, then their brain has got more energy to work out other things that they might have to be thinking about at the same time. And particularly, this is, I think, a very important one for you guys at home. And I repeat, home is home and should not try to be school. So keep a time limit to homework, and perhaps speak to your school and say, what is a suitable time limit for homework each day? And speak to the school if they cannot manage the whole task in that time. And it may be that you speak to the school and say, would you be happy for me to maybe ask them to dictate so I can write for them so they can get it done in the time? Or rather than doing all 10 of the sums that get progressively harder, can they do maybe 1, 3, 5, 7 and 9? So they're doing half of them, but they're still getting to the hard ones at the end. So keep that open dialogue with the school about that homework, because your student with slow processing speed is going to take longer to complete tasks. And we don't want home to become an extension of the stress of school as well. So that is slow processing speed. Jo, if you can move on, then I come to phonological awareness. Now, this is often the one that parents have never heard before. In fact, most of us are just about getting our head around phonics, because potentially that wasn't the way that we were taught to read either. And phonics is how you map a sound to a visual shape. So the sound k or s is matched to the shape of an S or a C. Okay, that is phonics. But there is a whole step before that that's got nothing to do with what is written, so nothing to do with the visual image of that sound, and that is phonological awareness. There's a program that's used in schools called, oh, sorry, Jo, can you move back? There's a program used in schools called Letters and Sounds. And phase 2 is where you start in reception, which is that mapping of a sound to a shape. Phase 1 is often done in nursery schools, but that is the phonological awareness phase. And if you're ever looking for anything to do around phonological awareness, if you just type in phase 1 of Letters and Sounds, you'll come up with a lot of activities there. But it is the ability to hear sounds within words, such as rhymes or alliteration, that they start with the same sound, and being able to manipulate them and work with them. It is hierarchical, which means that you have to have some of the earlier skills in place, because if there are gaps, it will impact on how the child learns phonics. And for me, the biggest impact that I see on gaps in phonological awareness is when a teacher or a parent says to me, I'm teaching them the phonics, and if I show them the flashcards or show them even a word, they can do it, but they cannot apply it when they're writing or when they're reading a full sentence. And that's usually because there's a phonological awareness gap that's not fluent. Now, on the right-hand side, and I apologise if on the device that you're looking at it is quite small, but let me just go through some of the areas of phonological awareness. Right at the beginning, we've got word awareness. So can they count the words in a sentence? Not one that's written down, but if you say a sentence, say, for example, we are going to the park, can they tell you that that is we are going to the park? They know that that is 6 words. Okay, that's very important, especially if you've got a child later on who is not leaving gaps between the words in their writing. It may be, just maybe, that they don't understand what a word is and they cannot separate the words out in a sentence. So that's right at the beginning. Then following on from that, we have got, and apologies, I'm struggling to look at this because my computer's just got a bit funny, alliteration. Sorry, it went black and white for a moment. Alliteration, which is identifying and producing words that begin with the same sound. So, for example, those silly sentences, Sarah sips strawberries on Sundays, but also it's games such as I Spy. You know, I Spy with my little eye, something that begins with and they have to look around the room for things that start with the M sound. Syllable awareness. So can they actually hear the syllables within words? Can they clap the beats in the word elephant? And rhyming. Can they hear rhymes, and can they produce rhymes? And for all those four things there, it's very important to understand that there are two steps to it. One is hearing it, and the other one is producing it. So can they hear that there's 6 words in a sentence, and then can they produce a sentence that's got 6 words? Can they hear that cat, fat and mat rhyme? Or then later on, can they produce something that rhymes with nose? Okay, so the production is always harder than the recognition. And then we move on to the next part of it, which is phonemic awareness, which is now the individual sounds within words. And again, this is still without seeing any of it written down. This is all oral games. So can they isolate the sound? What is the last sound in cat? Do they know that that's a t sound? Can they blend sounds orally? And you can beginning to see now how this is going to have some impact on their reading as well. Because if orally, as you're walking down the street, you say the word l, a, k. If they can't put l, a, k together to make lake orally as you're walking down the road, then they're not going to be able to do it when they're given the letters as well. Okay, they may be able to sound them out, but they won't be able to blend them. And then the opposite of that, segmenting the sounds, splitting them up orally. Deleting sounds, can they take the g away from gone? And so gone without the g is on. Can they do that? Because actually when you're spelling, once you've written the g down, all you're interested in now is in the on, is in the next bit. So they need to be able to delete a sound from a word. They also need to be able to add a sound to the word. So for example, if they've learnt to spell the word right, can they just put the word f, the sound f in the middle, and then they have the word fight? Okay, so can they add a sound to a word? And then can they substitute sounds, which is similar to what I've just done? So in a nutshell, that is phonological awareness. Okay, if we could have the next slide. What difficulties might I see at home? Well, now, this is difficult because what I'm saying there is not stuff that you would perhaps necessarily know. So the difficulties you may see at home are playing those sorts of games that I've just said, but also there may have been an issue with unclear speech, not because their lips can't make the sound, but possibly because they haven't heard the sound correctly. And so what they're repeating is wrong. They might have had difficulty learning nursery rhymes because they're pretty much all learned before the child can understand what they're saying. They're learning the rhythm and the sounds of it. Very few children actually understand the story of Jack and Jill when they're learning that nursery rhyme. What they're learning to do is repeat the sounds in the rhythm and the order that somebody else has done it. So they may have had that difficulty. As I said, they may appear as if they got a hearing difficulty because they repeat something wrong. So say, for example, you're introducing somebody and it's a new name that they've not come across, and they repeat the name, but they get it wrong. Now, remember, there's an age appropriateness to this. And there's many names that I have to repeat 3 or 4 times before I get it right. So there is an appropriateness to this. But generally, that might be something that you look at. They can't play I Spy, for example, and maybe they struggle with their expressive language because they are struggling to think of what words to put in next. So that's what you might see at home. The next slide is all about what can you do to help. So on here I've got some games, but I would just like to say that all these games are taken from, I think it's the Hertfordshire Phonological Awareness site, and you'll just see in the right hand side a screenshot of what that site looks like, so you can Google that. The book is a book called I Hear with My Little Ear, which is it's really recommended for schools, but there's so many lovely activities in there that can be done one-on-one with your child, or even a small group if you've got more than one child at home. But I wouldn't necessarily rush out to buy that, because if you were just to Google phonological awareness activities then you will come up with websites that have lots of different activities. But for example, roll a dice, and whatever the number is on the dice, can they think of a word with that number of syllables? okay, with that number of beats. Rhyming names, and be careful with what your child's name rhymes with if you're going to play this game, but make sentences to rhyme with their name. So for example, Ben likes to hide in his den. Okay, or you could, if perhaps your child has got a name that doesn't lend itself to many rhymes, go on a rhyme hunt. So in this room, I'm looking for something that rhymes with sock, and they find the clock. Or I'm looking for something that rhymes with bear, and they find the chair. Okay, if you don't want to do that practically around the house, you can do that just looking at a picture. Okay, maybe in their reading book or on a book that you've read to them. I can see something on this page that rhymes with chair, and they point to the bear. And then where is the sound? So you're going to say a word and you want to say, for example, the word is asked, and you want to know whether the S sound, the S sound, is at the beginning, middle, or end, and you just ask them to indicate. And there it gives you some ideas. They can indicate by having 3 boxes in front of them, and for that one they put their hand in the middle box because the S is in the middle. But when you say the word snake, they'll put their hand in the first box. So there's lots of lovely games that you can play to help with that. And the nice thing about them is that most of those games, because there's nothing written down for it, they lend themselves very well to traffic jams and queues, because you can just play them around about you. And it's very important just to continue to practice phonological awareness skills to maintain that fluency. So even if you think that they've got it all, just continue to play those games, especially if they do have a diagnosis of dyslexia, because what we need to make sure is that that remains a fluent skill. Thank you very much. Jo, over to you.
Thank you, Heidi. Lots of strategies there, isn't there? And I think they'll be very helpful for everyone at home. Right, okay, so this slide is just sort of really explaining the process. It's following on really from comments that that Heidi sort of described right at the start when we were looking at the true and false sort of quiz. Particularly thinking about an identification of dyslexia. So I'm just going to sort of read these statements just to make sure that that it's clear for you all. So the identification of dyslexia. So it's not an instant decision, and children do, because we're just well aware that children all learn very differently, and they don't learn at the same rate. And there may be a range of factors impacting on their progress, as we've sort of described throughout this sort of presentation. So identifying children who may be at risk of developing literacy difficulties, regardless of the cause, is a useful thing to do. And again, right at the beginning, we said, can SENCOs formally diagnose dyslexia, identify dyslexia? They can identify dyslexia, but informally, as we sort of described. And what's really important is for schools to be able to identify a particular difficulty that the child may be having, and then putting in some intervention and strategies to support them with the barriers that they have identified. So that's a really, really useful thing to be able to do. But again, what's really important, what Heidi sort of described right at the start, is that you don't have to have a label before you address the problem. That it's really important to take action at an early stage. So just like I've been saying, that any sort of difficulties that begin to be highlighted, and any concerns from parent and carers, as well as a school, that steps are made to begin to sort of identify any particular sort of barriers, and strategies and intervention is put in place at an early stage when a difficulty is noticed. And it's gathering that information about progress and performance over time. Again, sort of what Heidi was describing is that what we're really interested in seeing is, despite intervention over a period of time, a child or young person continues not to make progress. So that's what we're interested in seeing. But also is there any intervention and strategies that are sort of put into place, what the impact of those are, that we would be hopeful that children and young people begin to make progress, because of those strategies, and intervention is then going to be really supportive for them. Okay, right. So our next slide was sort of questions for
this one at the
chat.
end, Jo.
Exactly.
So let's move on, I think,
We'll
and we'll
move
do
on.
questions right at the end. Sorry to
Yeah.
butt in.
Quite all right. Right, so so this slide now then sort of describes any further information. You know, we've provided information in terms of those 5 areas of difficulty that links to Rose's definition of dyslexia that we use in Somerset. So we've looked at those in turns, what the difficulties are in those particular 5 areas, and strategies to be able to support at home. And you know, throughout we've signposted you to things that might help. However, there's also further information here that we just want to signpost you to. So there's the Dyslexia SPLD Trust that you can sort of Google and look at their website. There's lots of information. There's also Core Scotland. Heidi described that. There's been several resources that we've signposted to you throughout the presentation, but there's a lot more that can be found on Core Scotland. So that's a really, really useful website to have a look at. Also, the British Dyslexia Association, the BDA. Again, there's a wealth of information there to be sort of discovered. And also drawing your attention to the Somerset's local offer, you know, and what to expect from education. You may be aware that the Somerset core standards are currently being redeveloped, and we're sort of at the process of beginning to highlight schools and professionals and service teams, as well as parent carers, to launch events. So look out for a flyer that could well be heading your way. So that would be really important as well, that that the revised Somerset core standards, which are now Somerset's graduated response tool, and then there'll be a wealth of information on that as well to support you as parent carers. Okay, and then the final slide, we'll be very grateful if you could complete the post-training questions now. We asked you to complete the pre-training questions at the start of the presentation. We'd be very grateful if you could complete the post-training questions on the evaluation, and then you can then press submit. And that's going to be very helpful.
Yeah, sorry, for those of you that joined late, I have just put in the chat here the evaluation form. So if you could open that up and do the pre and post training questions now and submit it, we would be incredibly grateful, because it means that we can make changes to when we do this for the next time.
So we'll give you a minute or two just to do that. And then we'll come to any questions.
Yes, and I wonder, Richard, if you want to stop the recording now.
Yeah, I'm just going to stop it now.
Okay, thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Sam.
And I think